Then, of course, you have perhaps the most famous of all the archaic Homo sapiens lines, the Neanderthals. Far from being the examples of brutish, slouching cavemen that were represented in the early Victorian dioramas, it really now appears that they simply represent a distinct population of Homo sapiens that occupied Europe before any other archaic Homo sapiens population and thrived in that region of the world, well outside of the original range of hominins, well outside of the range of most of the plants and animals that would have been familiar. And so they became this distinct population. Here you can see a couple of reconstructions of a man and a woman. Again, perhaps with distinctive features, but certainly not outside the range of what is recognizably human. And what's also interesting is that many Neanderthals had red hair. They've identified the gene for red hair in Neanderthal fossil specimens. And it turns out that many Europeans and many people around the world, but especially high in frequency among Europeans and Native Americans, is Neanderthal DNA. As much as 3, occasionally 4% DNA in these European and Native American populations can be traced to Neanderthal ancestry. And you ask about what the Native American populations, it's like, well, this has to do with the circumpolar route taken by the ancestor of today's Native Americans, which we'll talk about soon in a lecture. But this confirmation of ancestry is particularly interesting because now what that means is that by the biological definition, Neanderthals were not a separate species from us, because if they were capable of reproducing and passing on their genes to populations today, I myself am only 1.5% Neanderthal. I was a little disappointed at that low score, but hey, 1.5% is still 1.5%. And that presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern populations indicates that they were in fact the same species as us and capable of producing fertile offspring who passed on their shared ancestry to their children and their grandchildren and so on and so forth. So they were us. They were just a different community of us. You can see here on the left sort of a forensic reconstruction of a Neanderthal, and here on the right you can see some of the characteristics that are often associated with Neanderthals. The sort of low elongated cranium, the pronounced occipital bun, relatively low forehead, lack of a pronounced chin. But what is really important to point out is that on average, if you take all the different examples of Neanderthals, hundreds of examples of Neanderthals that are known, and average out their cranial capacities, Neanderthals actually had larger, by size, larger brains than you and I. So again, that perception of them that was created in the Victorian era in the 1900s, and we'll talk about all the other things that were so amazing about how they interpreted things in the 1900s, turns out to probably be a gross imagination of what the data actually say. There's no indication that Neanderthals couldn't talk. There's no indication that they didn't have social interaction. It's now confirmed that they did have some kinds of artistic expression, and there's even a really fascinating evidence now coming out from new discoveries in Western Europe that the Neanderthal populations that were coming into contact with these modern human populations that were moving into Europe around 40,000 years ago, it seems like they actually began to adopt certain kinds of ideas and concepts. The technology, there seems to be Neanderthal technological traditions that are borrowing components from modern human populations. So there even seems to be the capability of, you know, intercultural exchange of knowledge between these Neanderthals and modern humans. And notice I said cultural and not species, because as we already defined, they're not a separate species. So very different, very distinct population, but not as different as is often represented. And here you can see the Neanderthal sites from Western Europe and Spain and France all the way through to the Near East, to the Shanidar example. I'll show you a picture here, Shanidar in northern Iraq, and as far east as the Uzbekistan. And you can see quite a lot of overlap between Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens. In fact, Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens existed at the same time on the planet for longer than we have existed without them. And that's interesting to think about. You can see some of the different kinds of technology, especially the Levallois technique, where you take this raw nodule, you shape it in a very particular fashion, and then you're able to remove with a single strike a spear-pointed blade, a spear-pointed shaped blade that can be used as a knife, a spear point, a lot of different things. But the whole kind of setup is dozens and dozens of steps that have to be followed in a very particular order to produce with one strike this desired result. And so again, in terms of cognition, this demonstrates a lot. Here's a reconstruction of Neanderthal community, some individuals here. And the flower burial at Shanidar in Iraq is one of the earliest examples known in the world for intentional burial. And this burial of an adult male in this cave site was conducted in such a way that large numbers of flowers were actually included in the burial. And this is the earliest evidence of that association between flowers and mortuary rituals that we have in the world. So if Neanderthals were capable of this, then really were they as different as we have perceived them to be. The different movements of populations. You have the first diaspora, you can see there in yellow, the movement of Homo erectus out of Africa into Europe and East Asia and Southeast Asia. You then have the second diaspora, or the Great Diaspora, where you see anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, behavioral being the key factor, behaviorally modern humans beginning around 70,000 years ago, moving not just into Europe and displacing the Neanderthal, but moving into Southeast Asia, being the first hominins to occupy the Australian continent, and moving all the way into the Americas. You can see here, when you draw the map out this way, you realize the size and the length of the migration that brought the ancestors of today's First Nations, indigenous populations of the Americas. That was the longest migration ever undertaken by humans in their history. Until we migrate to, another planet, that'll have to hold the record. And you can see here some of the variation in these early specimens of what we call anatomically modern humans. The much rounder compared to Neanderthals brain case. The chin, which interestingly enough, I should point out, they often say that Neanderthals lack a chin, but they don't actually. We don't have something that grew. It's not like a horn that grew out. What happened to us in our lineage is that our tooth rows, the teeth, actually moved back further under the eye sockets. So Neanderthals' teeth are further forward, and because the teeth are further forward, the bone of the jaw just goes up to meet the teeth. But if the teeth move backwards, you kind of push them in there like Play-Doh, then there's going to be, the chin is going to stay sticking out. And so that's actually what it is. The chin is there in Neanderthals, but the teeth are further forward. With us, the teeth are further back, and so you have the appearance of a chin. But it's not actually much longer in terms of the jaw. It's just where the teeth are placed along that jawbone. Some of the very earliest Homo sapiens are from Ethiopia and South Africa. Much older than Cro-Magnon. You might have heard of Cro-Magnon, but Cro-Magnon in France, which is very, very late. Cro-Magnon today, by comparison, is so late it's almost not in the early human category. It's just in the old people category. Certainly compared to the evidence from places like Shkul and Jebel Kafsa in the Near East, and Herto and Omo in Ethiopia, Border Cave and Kleises River mouth in South Africa. Those sites at the southern end of the distribution are particularly interesting, and we'll talk about those in a minute. We also see the earliest evidence for people in Australia at the sites of Lake Mungo and Cow Swamp here. These are between about 45 and 55,000. There's some indication of presence by 60,000, but for sure people were in Australia 55,000 years ago. While Neanderthals were still the dominant population in Europe, already anatomically and behaviorally modern humans, the ancestors of today's Australian Aboriginal communities, had already reached and occupied Australia. The earliest anatomically modern Homo sapiens that we're aware of are these individuals from the site of Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, and they date to around 300,000 years ago. We know that anatomically, in terms of cranial anatomy and postcranial skeletal anatomy, they match us physically. Whether they were behaviorally the same as us is currently unresolved. More research needs to be done in terms of locating not just fossil skeletal materials, but archaeological sites associated with them. And some of those things are particularly difficult to do when all you have are skeletal materials. And on the right there you see a reconstruction, a digital reconstruction of this Jebel Irhoud individual, the earliest known anatomically modern Homo sapiens. We know that by between 90 and 80,000 years ago in Central Africa, humans are capable of making tools like these harpoons, which they're using to harpoon these giant catfish that are like 200 plus pound catfish are being harpooned in the rivers of Central Africa between 90 and 80,000 years ago. And this is really where you begin to see this, some of the earliest examples of this, where technology really begins to take off and become absolutely dominant in our lives as humans. Imagining our lives without it is virtually impossible. And I don't mean by technology, digital technology, I mean bone harpoons technology really becomes the dominant way that humans interact with the world around them. And so these are some of the earliest, most sophisticated tools known, far earlier than any examples like this outside of Europe, outside of Africa, are these from Katanda. Other early Upper Paleolithic technologies, you begin to see very refined bifaces and spear points. You begin to see the manufacture of blades of stone. Rather than everything being a hand axe, people begin to make very sophisticated composite tools using standardized shaped thin blades of stone that you can put in and out of a haft. As one becomes dull, you can throw that one away and put in a new sharp one, like old style razor blades, right? And these technologies, not only do you see these that I'm showing here, but technologies seem to proliferate in their variety, depending upon the circumstances, depending upon the raw materials, depending upon the resources that you're hunting. You're not going to use a harpoon against an elephant, right? That'd be a very Wile E. Coyote kind of thing to do. But the proliferation of technology really begins rapidly here in the Upper Paleolithic with the after Katanda, and then in southern Africa, all over the place, at a number of different localities, we begin to see the earliest evidence of symbolic behavior around 70,000 years ago, right after a major eruption of a volcano in Indonesia by the name of Toba, which created massive and rapid shifts in climate and precipitation, and which, based upon the DNA evidence that we have, may have actually dropped the effective population of humans on the planet to less than 2,000. You're talking about, a serious, kind of apocalyptic Walking Dead type scenario with fewer than 2,000 people left on the entire planet. Right after that, it really seems like you see a true explosion of technology and symbolic behavior and migration. It really seems that that catalyst created the survival of the smartest, the survival of the cleverest, the survival of the most willing to adapt and change, rather than the strongest, right? And so it's a dramatic shift in the development of humanity, where we see evidence for the use of paint and symbols and abstractions. It's a whole new way to communicate, right? Just like the printing press, just like the internet, this was a whole new way to communicate concepts and ideas that hadn't existed before. Some of the oldest painted art in the world, currently believed to be older than any of the painted art in Europe, dates to around 40,000 years ago in Indonesia. And here you can see some of the examples. You can see a small species of island deer and pigs there, as well as a couple of hand stencils on the wall there. And this is very recently discovered and press released. So it has not been fully investigated at this point, but it's believed to be around 40,000 years old. The earliest reports of this happened a few years ago, and it's been confirmed by initial estimates. Chauvet Cave in France is the oldest gallery of art in Europe and dates to around 32,000 years ago. And this is just one small piece of just an epic gallery of ancient art that's one of the most magnificent known. And of course, Lascaux, you've heard of, and Altamira in Spain, and those are only about 17,000 years old. But you can see that from those earliest sophisticated technologies in Katanda and in South Africa, by 40,000 years ago, by 30,000 years ago, people all over the globe are producing incredibly sophisticated examples of art and communication, and are absolutely fully modern in every sense of the term, in terms of behavior, in terms of language, in terms of capacity for learning and teaching. So this is, these are just sort of some of the later examples, the high points of some of these different traditions, but they define sort of this era of human history. But the story's even more complex than that. Can you believe it? So we have Homo sapiens. We've talked about the Neanderthals a little bit. But it's not just the Australopithecines and then archaic Homo sapiens and then Neanderthals and whatnot. Now, we know that there were at least 3 other species of hominins that were contemporary with our early Homo sapiens and Neanderthal ancestors. And those include species from the Indonesian island of Flores, the Philippine island of Luzon, and the Denisovans from Siberia and East Asia. So at one point, probably as late as about 40,000 years ago, there were as many as 5 different kinds of people, hominins, on the planet. That we know the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals and the Denisovans were actually closely enough related to one another to be able to interbreed, as we'll talk about here in a second. The island examples from Luzon and Flores, we don't see any evidence in the DNA of their actually being close enough to our kind to interbreed. They may actually represent completely different species of hominins, but they would have been there when our ancestors first arrived in these places. And so our ancestors would have contacted entirely different species of sentient, bipedal, tool-using hominins. So at one point, it seems maybe our planet was a little bit more like Mos Eisley Cantina than we thought. Homo floresensis, you can see here on the top right kind of a comparison between a modern human female of about 5'3" or so with the Flores hominid, which was only barely over 3 feet tall. Yet they were making spears and tools and hunting, even some of these pygmy stegodon elephants that lived on the island. They're probably not descended from Homo erectus, but from earlier Homo habilis. And how they got all the way out to Flores is still an unresolved question. And they've been nicknamed by researchers the hobbits because of their stature, and I think because they were found initially around the same time as Peter Jackson's movies were coming out. But they did live in a world with dragons, as you can see from the bottom left illustration. These would have been Komodo dragons, but from their perspective, close enough. Pygmy elephants and giant rats, which actually formed a major component of the diet. You can see the comparison there between a modern rat and the Flores giant rat. A very different world, very different kind of relative experience for these hominins who were certainly a different species from us, and really fascinating to consider that. And you can see here in the comparison of the skulls, Homo sapiens to Floresensis, the difference in size. And you can see some of the ideas. This was sort of I didn't make this chart, but how these different individuals got there. Were they dwarfed examples of Homo erectus? Very recent research published late last year indicates they were not, that they were closely related to Homo habilis, that there was an earlier migration even prior to 2 million years ago where they got the ancestors of the hobbits, the ancestors of Homo floresensis, into South Asia and eventually into what is today Indonesia, which at the time was still an island. That's the thing. Flores is far enough out in Indonesia that it was not part of the what's called the Sunda Shelf, and it's actually across the Wallace Line. We can talk more about that in a later class. The Denisovans are a whole nother, even more recently discovered piece of our lineage, and they diverged from the Neanderthal lineage probably around 300,000 years ago, and they have now been found across Siberia and into China. Denisova Cave is the type site, and may have persisted until as late as 30,000 years ago. What you can see here on the right is an artist's reconstruction based upon the extensive genetic analysis they've done on the teeth and bones that they found at these different sites in Siberia and China, and using that genetic traits that they're able to recover from these to come up with a generalized idea of what this young woman would have looked like. Again, distinct in terms of the genetics and appearance from both Neanderthals and modern humans, but still within the range of being recognizably a person. What's really fascinating is that there were multiple lines of interbreeding with both Neanderthals in the western part of the range of the Denisovans, as well as modern humans in Siberia and East Asia. And modern human populations from Southeast Asia and Australasia, particularly the populations in New Guinea and Australia bear as much as 6% Denisovan ancestry. And so it seems that the Denisovans may have actually interbred even more with modern humans than did the Neanderthals. Either that or there were more of them. One of the new ideas about the disappearance of the Neanderthals is that they may have lived in very small populations, given the harshness of the Ice Age climate in Europe and the frequent relocations necessitated by the glacial periods. They may not have built up as large a population, and when you have large numbers of African populations moving into Europe, it simply may have been a factor that there weren't nearly as many Neanderthals as there were the incoming modern humans, and so they would have ended up getting swamped. If the Denisovans living in places like South Asia and Indonesia and sort of the area around what is today the Tibetan Plateau, if they were living in larger populations, then when modern humans moved into the landscape, there would have been greater opportunity for genetic contributions, to put it in technical terms, than with very small separated populations of Neanderthals in Ice Age Europe. Sometimes the environment and demographics can play a role in these processes as well. And here's a really interesting genetic analysis from the the Denisovan individual named Denny, a female. And what is really interesting, she was born about 90,000 years ago. And what we see evidence that her mother was more closely related to Neanderthals from a site in Croatia than from a local Neanderthal who lived in Denisova Cave 30,000 years earlier. And her father was actually related to not only the Denisovans, but to another hominin species that had some admixture with his line earlier. And you can see all of these different lines of interconnection between Denisovans, Neanderthals, modern humans. And you can see the different points of interbreeding between Asian populations, the Eurasian populations before they split, and then you have African populations. And so all of these different kinds of people that at one point scholars were calling distinct species, right? Homo neanderthalensis is, the naming even suggests it's a different species. But look at all of this. Look at all of this interbreeding and shared ancestry and sharing of genetic contributions that's going on from, Eastern Europe all the way across to China and Asia. And this is occurring 90,000 years ago. And it really highlights the fact that the notion of any kind of population at any point in history, even in the deep, deep past, being somehow all one thing, is absolutely a complete fiction. Not even at the roots of our species have we ever been all one thing, right? And here you can see some of the kinds of, this is a really interesting chart. I won't read the lines to you, I'll just leave it up here for a minute. But it's showing things like the Wallace Line, a deep water boundary there between Borneo and Java and the rest of East Indonesia, the island of Sulawesi, Flores, New Guinea, etc. That's never been land, right? That's always been deep enough water that everything to the east has always been separated from the west, at least in the last 2 million years that we're talking about here. And that may have prevented frequent mixing from hominids on either side. So this may have been one of the things that produced some of those distinct populations, like the Luzonensis or the Floresensis. And you also see that the Altai Denisovans, the Denisovans from Siberia and Northeast Asia, were distinct from the Denisovans from Southeast Asia. We're able to see the genetic differences there. And yet, if you look on the chart below, you can see all of these multiple points of interbreeding between the Papuans and Southeast Asians, East Asians and Siberians. And so when we begin to look at these ideas of race and whatnot, you begin to realize that it's all something that we have constructed far more recently, and that these boundaries didn't exist back then and don't really exist today either, except where we want them to. And that brings me to the last little bit that I'm going to talk about here in this lecture, and that's one of the things that has been talked about the most in terms of defining different human populations over the last 500 years, and that's skin color. Here you can see the geographical distributions of skin color in indigenous human populations, right? And you can see areas where you have the greatest amount of, or have the darkest skin color, contrasting with areas of lighter skin color. You can see the only place where you have really, really, really light skin is in Europe. Interestingly enough, the distribution that you see, the really, really light skin, seems to be fairly coterminous with the range of the Neanderthals. Whether this is a coincidence or not, we can debate. But you also see the areas where you have the oldest established human populations. Africa, small portions of the Indian subcontinent, and Australia and Papua New Guinea that we were just talking about have very dark complected people. And yet, genetically, the populations from Australia and sub-Saharan Africa are not more closely related to one another than either of those is to Europeans. Sub-Saharan Africans are equally related to Europeans and Australians. How does that work? Because what you're seeing here on this map is not a map of relatedness, not a map of ancestry, but is a map of human biological response to particular stimuli. And what are those? Well, what you're looking at is basically a distribution of ultraviolet radiation. Human beings need a couple of things that are related to this story. One of those is vitamin D. Vitamin D is produced in your dermal layer of your skin and actually helps you to be able to metabolize calcium. If you have a vitamin D deficiency, it doesn't matter how many gallons of milk you drink, you'll not be able to utilize the calcium effectively. Why do you think they enrich milk with vitamin D? You need vitamin D to be able to do that. That's a really important nutrient, especially for women who are carrying a child or gestating a child in their womb. Because if a woman doesn't have sufficient calcium, the child will be assembled from the calcium of her own bones. Body will dissolve those to make the bones of the fetus. So if that's happening, then she's going to have calcium deficiencies, which are going to lead to weaker bones, which are going to lead to a higher likelihood of problems with birth, higher likelihood of maternal mortality at birth. Because when you give birth, there's a lot of strain put on the bones, and the pubic symphysis, where that pelvis comes together in the middle, actually cracks and comes apart to accommodate the skull of the child. And if you have weakened bones as a result of a calcium deficiency, you will be more likely, not always, but you will be more likely to die in childbirth, which until very, very recently in human history happened all the time, right? So increasing that likelihood means that women who have calcium deficiencies are not going to probably, by statistics, have as many children as women who have sufficient calcium. So to have sufficient calcium, you need to have sufficient vitamin D. And vitamin D is produced in your skin or in mushrooms and a few other nutrients, but by and large in your skin from exposure to sunlight, right? But, so yeah, get a lot of sunlight, get a lot of sunlight. However, if you get too much sunlight, it destroys another important nutrient, and that's folic acid. Folic acid, in terms of the story that we're telling, it acts as the toner for your body's copier, if you will. Every time your cells divide, use folic acid as part of the enzymatic process of cell division. So this also occurs when a fetus is developing after conception. The cells divide and divide and divide and divide, and if the mother's body has a folic acid deficiency, and that's the toner for the copier, and if you know anything about copiers, if the toner runs out, what happens to the quality of the copies? The quality of the copies goes down. And if you're talking about dividing and dividing and dividing from a single fertilized egg, and the quality of the copies goes down, that's going to increase the likelihood of developmental issues with the fetus. It's going to increase the incidence of cleft palates. It's going to increase the incidence of spinal bifida, a number of other developmental issues that we could go into, but all of those fall under that category. And so you would increase the likelihood of all of those difficulties with a folic acid deficiency. So humans have to find the optimum kind of solution. If you're in a place that has lots and lots of sunlight, I'll go to the next one here. Here's a map of UV radiation and vitamin D production. If you live within an area that has lots and lots of sunlight, the tropics, then you have very little difficulty producing enough vitamin D. That vitamin D is not going to be your problem. Also because what's the temperature in the tropics most of the year? Do you need to wear head-to-toe, full-length parka clothing and a face mask that covers your eyes so that you don't get snow blindness? No, you don't have to wear that much clothing. It's warm. There's a lot of sun. So you get all the vitamin D you could possibly need from, very brief exposure in that part of the world. So what is the issue for populations occupying the tropics? Yeah, it's the folic acid. You have to protect the folic acid. So the biological response of populations in that area would be for their melanocytes, the cells in your skin that produce melanin, and the amount that gets produced. That's why people can tan, right? The cells get stimulated and they produce melanin. Some people tan. I just turn pink like a shrimp. But basically, people who have more melanocytes are able to adjust and adapt to those circumstances. And where this plays out is that those populations, there's an advantage to having more melanin because that protects your folic acid, which protects your gestating fetus, which leads to more successful births with children who don't have these developmental issues, which leads to more people having more kids. And so that developmental process and that multi-generational process leads to an advantage being given in terms of reproduction to people with more melanin in those tropical regions. As you move out of the tropical regions, you get to places, you can see here, that have insufficient amounts of vitamin D production. Sometimes 1 month out of the year, sometimes most of the year. And if you're not getting enough vitamin D, then you're having those calcium deficiencies. Then you're having issues with lactation, you're having issues with osteoporosis, you're having issues with maternal and infant mortality, so on and so forth. So there's an advantage to getting more vitamin D. Well, how do you get more vitamin D? Where is the advantage there? Well, the advantage there would be to having less melanin, less tinting on the window, so to speak. And so you let in as much as possible. Also, as you go further north, even in areas where you can see it's insufficient 1 month out of the year, but as you go further north, you have to typically, through most of the year, cover up more of your body until you get into, northern Norway, right? And you have to basically cover up all of the time. And you're not running around with very, little covering. And so most of your body is covered, which means it's getting zero input of sunlight. So what's getting any input of sunlight? The back of your hands and your face, But again, if you've got that parka pulled down, how much of your skin is actually exposed? And so the biological response to covering up and moving north or south into these other areas, the biological response is to get rid of as much of that blocking melanin as possible, because you need every tiny drop of vitamin D you can get, and you're not worried about losing your folic acid because 95% of your body is covered up all the time. So the advantage there, the reproductive advantage there, is toward individuals, and this is all about women for the most part. Men sort of are byproducts of that. But the women, the advantage goes to the ones who have less melanin. And so over time, populations living further away from the equator, there's going to be an advantage to having less melanin. Populations living closer to the equator, there's going to be an advantage to having more melanin. That's what the adaptive story of these things is about. That's why you see Australian and African populations having almost the same quote-unquote amount of melanin, but not because they're especially closely related more than they are to the Norwegians, but because the native Australians have been living there, as we talked about, for 55,000 years. Even the Europeans modern humans haven't been in Europe as long as the Australians have been in Australia, right? If we go back to that other map, you can see that one of the other things that happens is that you don't see the same distribution in the tropics of the Americas. Why don't you see the same distribution of skin tone in the tropics of the Americas? Because, as we'll talk about in an upcoming lecture, the native people in the Americas have not been in the Americas as long as modern humans have been in Australia, or as long as modern humans have been in Europe. They've actually been in the Americas for maybe, at most, 18,000 years. Maybe 20, if we're really trying to push it here. But at the outside, they've been here for about 18,000 years. And there has been some adjustment of skin tone. You do see higher amounts of melanin production in the tropical populations of the indigenous people of the Americas. But they haven't been here long enough for that process to have reached the same level as in Australia and Africa. And this is another way that we know that the places that our people have been the longest are in Africa. And Africa is the homeland of our whole species. We are all African. Those of us who live outside of Africa are just the descendants of different waves of immigrants. And I'll close out with that. Thank you very much. Have a good day.